Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. Getting ready for this one, I was thinking back to when I first became a parent. And man, the amount of advice and information coming at you from every direction, it's just overwhelming.
It really is. It can feel like you're drowning in it sometimes. So many different opinions, so many supposed experts, all telling you what to do.
Yeah. And you just want what's best for your little one, but figuring out what that actually is can be so tricky. So to try and make sense of it all, we're diving into Cribsheet today. This book, it's by Emily Oster and and it's basically like having a data-driven guide for all those big and small parenting decisions that come up in that first year.
That first year is such a whirlwind, too. You go from those first few days in the hospital, figuring out how to even hold this tiny human, to suddenly having to make choices about things like sleep schedules and whether to introduce purees or try baby-led weaning. Right. And those early decisions, they can feel so momentous. It's like every little thing you do will somehow determine their entire future. So in this deep dive, we're going to really unpack the research and evidence behind those common parenting practices so you can, breathe a little easier and maybe feel a bit more confident in your choices.
We'll look at everything from swaddling to sleep training, breastfeeding, introducing solids, navigating those tricky milestones, even how your work decisions might play into things. We know you, the learner, really value getting to the heart of the matter quickly. So think of this as your shortcut to understanding a ton of research without having to read through stacks of scientific papers.
Okay, let's jump right in. Let's start at the very beginning. Those first few days after birth, you're in the hospital, you're recovering, and you're getting to know this brand new little person.
One thing that's interesting to consider is how much hospital stays have changed over time. It used to be quite common for new mothers to stay for a week or even longer, especially after a C-section.
Yeah, my grandmother was telling me about how she stayed in the hospital for like 10 days after my mom was born.
Wow, that's a long time. These days, though, with insurance limitations and the push for earlier discharges, it's typically 2 nights for a vaginal birth, maybe 3 or 4 for a C-section, or if there are any complications.
And it is such a blur those first few days. You're exhausted, you're emotional, you're still processing what just happened, and suddenly you're supposed to be taking care of this completely dependent little being. Emily Oster describes it as suddenly having a whole person to take care of, which I think is a great way to put it.
It really is. And even though they're tiny, they come with some pretty big decisions right off the bat. Circumcision, for example, is often something parents need to decide on fairly quickly.
And that can be such a loaded topic with so many different factors influencing that decision. For some families, it's a religious or cultural tradition. For others, they might be considering potential medical benefits. And then there's the ongoing debate about the ethics of the procedure.
It can definitely be tough to navigate. So what does the research actually tell us about the risks and benefits? Well, like any surgical procedure, there's always a risk of infection. But the good news is that when circumcision is performed in a hospital setting by trained medical professionals, the overall risk of complications is quite low.
So those complications, how often do they happen?
Well, Cribsheet cites estimates that suggest minor complications like bleeding or infection might occur in about 1.5% of cases. Serious adverse complications are thankfully incredibly rare. There's also the possibility of what they call a poor aesthetic outcome, basically. The circumcision not healing quite as expected, which might require a minor revision surgery later on. That appears to be a bit more common statistically than the overall complication rate.
So the risks are generally small, but definitely worth considering and discussing with your doctor as part of that decision-making process. Another thing that comes up pretty quickly is giving that newborn their first bath.
Right, and that little one they come out covered in quite a lot, blood, amniotic fluid, and that vernix, which is that kind of waxy, cheesy coating.
Yeah, the vernix. I remember thinking it looked a bit strange, but it's actually there for a reason, right?
It is. It actually acts as a protective barrier for the baby's skin. And it's interesting to note that those very first baths aren't actually medically necessary. Delaying the first bath for a bit can actually be beneficial for their skin.
But I imagine a lot of parents are pretty eager to get all that stuff off their newborn. So when you do decide to give that first bath, is there any evidence about whether tub baths are better than just using a sponge?
Actually, the data suggests that tub baths might be slightly better for newborns than sponge baths.
Okay, good to know. Now let's talk about something that can be a real source of stress for new parents: infant weight loss in those first few days. It feels like every conversation in the hospital revolves around whether the baby is gaining enough weight.
Oh yeah, it can be a huge source of anxiety. You're already exhausted and emotional, and then you're constantly being weighed and measured. And it can feel like a personal failure if your baby isn't gaining as quickly as everyone expects.
Right. But Cribsheet really breaks down the typical weight loss patterns and emphasizes that some weight loss is completely normal in those very early days. Around 48 hours after birth, a baby born vaginally might have lost about 7% of their birth weight. And for some babies, that weight loss can even continue up to 72 hours.
And this is where understanding the context is so important. Those hospital guidelines about supplementation, like that 10% weight loss trigger, really need to be considered in relation to the baby's age. At 72 hours old, a 10% weight loss might still be within the realm of normal for some babies. But if that same 10% loss happened at, say, 12 hours old, that would be a much more concerning situation.
And if supplementation is recommended, it's typically formula or donor milk these days, right? Not water or sugar water like they used to do.
Exactly. And Cribsheet even mentions this great website, www.newbornweight.org, where you can plug in your baby's information and see where they fall on the growth charts. It can be really reassuring to see that, even if your little one is losing a bit of weight initially, they're still within a healthy range.
And for breastfeeding mothers, there's that big worry that if you do supplement with formula, even a little bit, it'll somehow sabotage your milk supply.
Yeah, that's a common concern. And the research on that specific question is actually a bit limited. It's hard to isolate the impact of a small amount of early supplementation, especially since there are so many other factors that can influence breastfeeding success. But the general consensus among lactation experts is that a little bit of formula in those first few days, if truly necessary, shouldn't negatively impact your ability to establish a good milk supply in the long run.
Another thing that can be pretty scary for new parents is jaundice. When the baby's skin has that yellowish or orangey tint.
It is a little alarming when you first see it, but it's important to know that not all jaundice requires treatment. Many mild cases will actually resolve on their own as the baby starts feeding well and their liver matures.
But how do they know if it's serious enough to need treatment?
They test the baby's bilirubin levels. Sometimes they'll start with a non-invasive test using a light meter on the skin. But if that reading is elevated, they'll do a blood test, usually taken via a heel prick. And if the bilirubin levels are high enough to warrant treatment, the typical approach is phototherapy.
Ah, yes, the Billy lights.
Yeah, the Billy box, as some people call it. It's basically a special kind of light therapy that helps to break down the bilirubin in the baby's body. And they'll continue to monitor those levels with blood tests to see how the baby's responding. It's important to remember that what constitutes a high bilirubin level that needs treatment actually depends on the baby's age in hours and their risk category.
So it's not just a single number.
Nope, it's more nuanced than that. They take into account how old the baby is, their gestational age at birth, and any other health factors to determine what level is concerning. Cribsheet mentions this really helpful website, www.getbillytool.org, that has those specific bilirubin charts, so you can see the thresholds for treatment based on those different factors.
Okay, now let's shift gears and talk about some of those common concerns that tend to pop up once you're home with your newborn. Swaddling, for example, is a big one, especially for sleep.
It can be a real game changer in those early weeks. Babies love that feeling of being snugly wrapped up. It reminds them of being in the womb, and it can help to calm their startle reflex, which often wakes them up.
But it's not something you can do forever, right?
Unfortunately not. At some point, they get too big and strong, and they start to roll, which can become a safety concern if they're still swaddled. And breaking that swaddle habit can definitely be a challenge. We experienced that firsthand with our daughter, Penelope.
I remember you telling me about that. You tried to wean her off gradually, but it just backfired.
Yeah, it did. We thought we were being so clever with our gradual plan, but every time we loosened the swaddle a bit, she slept worse. And then, wouldn't you know it, we ended up relying on the rock and play to get her to sleep, which wasn't really what we wanted long term.
And I remember you were telling me about seeing these ridiculously large swaddles online, marketed for babies who were like a year old.
Oh yeah, there's a whole black market for those things.
Oh, yeah.
But as Cribsheet points out, just because you can find something online doesn't mean it's a good idea. And bigger swaddles definitely aren't recommended for older babies.
Yeah.
We actually had a rather abrupt weaning experience with our son, Finn. We had a whole plan in place, but then we had a power outage during a heat wave. His room got so incredibly hot and the swaddle was just too much. So we went cold turkey, completely unswaddled. And you know what? He slept fine.
Wow, that's amazing. Sometimes those unplanned events can lead to the best solutions. But it's so easy to second-guess yourself as a parent. You're constantly wondering if you're doing the right thing, if your baby is developing normally. That big question, is my kid normal? It starts so early, doesn't it?
It really does. Are they peeing enough?
Mm,
Are they crying too much? Are they gaining enough weight? And then, it moves on to those bigger milestones when they should be rolling over, sitting up, crawling, walking, talking. It's natural to compare your baby to other babies and worry if they're not right in the middle of the pack for everything.
right, and pediatricians are great for making sure there are no major medical concerns, but they're not always focused on those finer points of development. Like when my daughter wasn't walking by 15 months, I was a bit worried. But our pediatrician just said, we'll check again at 18 months, and if she's still not walking, we'll look into it.
It's hard not to worry, though. And then there's colic, which is this whole other beast.
Oh, colic. I remember those nights. Just endless crying, and you feel so helpless. What even causes colic, anyway?
It's actually still a bit of a mystery. There are a lot of theories out there: immature digestion, imbalances in gut bacteria, sensitivities to certain proteins in the mother's diet or formula. But the exact cause isn't fully understood. And there are so many supposed remedies out there: drops, gripe water, special teas. But the evidence for most of them is pretty weak.
Yeah, we tried everything with Penelope, and nothing really seemed to work. You just kind of have to ride it out and hope for the best.
And focus on taking care of yourself during that time, too, because it's incredibly stressful for parents.
Absolutely. And then there's the whole thing about protecting your newborn from germs. You want to keep them in a bubble, but that's not really realistic, is it?
No, it's not. And Cribsheet actually raises an interesting point about being overly cautious in those first few weeks. If a very young newborn gets a fever, the standard medical protocol is to do a whole bunch of tests to rule out serious infections. But if it turns out to just be a common cold, all those tests and procedures can be pretty traumatic for a tiny baby.
So the advice to keep germy toddlers away from newborns, it's not just about being paranoid, it's about potentially avoiding unnecessary medical interventions.
Right. And the thing is, most colds in newborns are actually pretty minor. They might be fussy, they might have a runny nose, but they'll usually recover on their own with just some supportive care.
Okay, let's talk about something that's often overlooked, the mother's recovery after childbirth. It's such a huge physical and emotional transition.
It really is. And I think we don't talk about it enough. Postpartum bleeding, for example, it can be a lot heavier and last a lot longer than many women expect. It typically starts out heavier, and you might even pass some clots, which can be a bit scary. But it should gradually taper off over several weeks.
And that first bowel movement after birth? Let's just say it's not always the most pleasant experience.
Definitely not. Stool softeners are often recommended, and even then, it can be a bit uncomfortable. And after a C-section, things can be even more challenging because you're also dealing with the pain from the incision and the recovery from major surgery.
And just the general level of pain and discomfort in those early weeks, whether you had a vaginal birth or a C-section, can be really intense. I remember those first few nights, I was so thirsty, but even reaching for a glass of water felt incredibly painful.
And the recovery from a C-section typically takes longer. So having extra help around the house is really crucial, especially for things like getting out of bed, going to the bathroom, and lifting the baby. Even just doing those basic things can be really tough in those first few weeks.
And getting back to exercise, I know a lot of women are eager to start feeling like themselves again physically. What are the typical recommendations?
The advice is generally to start slowly and gradually increase your activity level. Gentle walking is usually okay soon after a vaginal delivery, but with a C-section, you'll need to be much more cautious and follow your doctor's instructions carefully.
And I remember you telling me about that time you had a complete meltdown because the little knitted hat you made for Penelope was too big.
Oh yeah, it sounds so silly now, but at the time, it felt like a complete catastrophe. Those postpartum hormones, they can really mess with your emotions. It's important to remember that a lot of women experience what's called the baby blues in those first few weeks. Some tearfulness, some irritability, some anxiety.
And that's different from postpartum depression, right?
Yes, it is. Postpartum depression is more serious and involves symptoms that last for more than a couple of weeks, like persistent low mood, loss of interest in things you used to enjoy, changes in appetite and sleep, feelings of guilt or worthlessness. And it's important to emphasize that it's not just mothers who can experience this. Fathers, partners, adoptive parents, anyone in that primary caregiver role can develop postpartum depression.
So if you're struggling, don't hesitate to reach out for help. Talk to your doctor, a therapist, or a support group. There are resources available. Okay, let's dive into breastfeeding, which is a whole other topic that comes with its own set of challenges and pressures.
Oh, for sure. And it's often so much harder than people expect. There's this idea that it should just come naturally, but the reality is that a lot of women encounter difficulties in those early weeks.
We actually asked our followers on social media to share their breastfeeding challenges, and the responses were overwhelming. Everything from latch problems to sore nipples, concerns about milk supply, those unexpected letdowns at the most inconvenient times. It's clear that a lot of women go through it.
Absolutely. And what's really striking is that despite how common these struggles are, many women feel like they're the only ones experiencing them. There's this societal pressure to breastfeed exclusively and effortlessly, and when it's not working out that way, it can lead to a lot of shame and guilt. So if you're struggling, please know that you are not alone.
So when we look at the evidence, what are some of the interventions that have actually been shown to help with breastfeeding success?
One thing that consistently shows positive results is skin-to-skin contact. Holding your baby directly against your skin, especially in those first few hours after birth, can really help to stimulate those breastfeeding hormones and encourage a good latch.
And having access to good support from lactation professionals can make a big difference too.
Absolutely. Whether it's a lactation consultant, a nurse with specialized training, or even a really knowledgeable friend or family member, having someone who can provide hands-on help with latch and positioning and just answer all those questions that inevitably come up is so valuable.
What about some of those more specific interventions you sometimes hear about, like nipple shields or tongue tie surgery?
Nipple shields can be helpful in certain situations, like if you have flat or inverted nipples or if your nipples are really sore. But they're not a cure-all, and sometimes they can actually make it harder for the baby to get a good latch. Tongue tie or lip tie surgery is another thing that's sometimes recommended if the baby has a tight frenulum that's interfering with their ability to latch. But it's a controversial procedure, and it's not always necessary.
And milk supply, that's a constant source of anxiety for many breastfeeding mothers. What does the research say about increasing milk supply?
Well, the basic principle is that milk production is driven by demand. The more milk that's removed from the breast, the more the body will produce. So frequent feeding and emptying the breasts effectively are really important. Pumping after feedings can also be helpful for some women, but there's not a ton of research on the most optimal pumping schedule.
And pumping at work adds a whole other layer of complexity, doesn't it?
It totally does. Finding the time and the space, making sure everything is clean. It can feel like a second job sometimes. And that whole thing about looking at pictures of your baby while you pump to help with letdown, there's actually not a lot of evidence to support that.
Really? I always thought that was a thing.
It seems logical, but the research is actually pretty inconclusive. Okay, let's circle back to those breastfeeding benefits we always hear about. What does the data actually support?
Because it often feels like breastfeeding is presented as the ultimate key to raising a healthy, intelligent child. And if you can't or choose not to breastfeed, you're somehow failing your baby.
Right. And there definitely are some well-established benefits to breastfeeding. For the baby, breast milk provides antibodies that help to protect them from infections, and it's easier to digest than formula. And for the mother, breastfeeding can lower the risk of certain types of cancer.
But some of those more dramatic claims, like boosting IQ, aren't as clear-cut, are they?
They're not. When you really look at the research, a lot of those claims aren't as strongly supported as you might think. For example, there was a famous study that showed a link between breastfeeding and higher IQ scores. But when they adjusted for factors like maternal intelligence and socioeconomic status, the effect basically disappeared.
So breastfeeding is definitely good, but it's not the be-all and end-all of parenting.
Exactly. And it's so important to remember that fed is best. If you can breastfeed and you want to, that's great. But if you can't, or you choose not to, that's perfectly okay too. There are plenty of other ways to nurture and bond with your baby.
Okay, let's talk about another big one, infant sleep. Specifically, those recommendations about sleep position, sleeping location, and figuring out a sleep schedule.
Sleep is such a huge topic for new parents. You're exhausted, you just want your baby to sleep, and there's so much conflicting advice out there about the right way to do it.
Right. And it's scary too. You hear about SIDS, and you just want to do everything you can to keep your baby safe.
Yeah.
So what does the evidence actually say about reducing the risk of SIDS?
The American Academy of Pediatrics, the AAP, has 4 main recommendations. Placing the baby on their back to sleep, making sure they're sleeping alone in a crib or bassinet, having them sleep in the parents' room, but not in the same bed, for at least the first 6 months, and keeping the crib free of any soft or loose items like blankets, pillows, or bumpers.
And the back sleeping recommendation, that one is pretty much universally agreed upon, right?
It is. There used to be this idea that babies should sleep on their stomachs to prevent them from choking on spit up. But research actually showed that stomach sleeping significantly increased the risk of SIDs. So back sleeping is the way to go.
What about bed sharing? That one seems to be really controversial.
It is. Some people swear by it, but the evidence does show a moderate increase in SIDs risk associated with bed sharing. And that risk is even higher if the parents smoke, have been drinking alcohol, or if the baby was born prematurely or at a low birth weight.
So it's probably best to err on the side of caution. And room sharing, having the baby sleep in the same room as the parents but in their own crib, that's still recommended.
The AAP still recommends it for at least the first 6 months, but the evidence supporting its benefits for SIs prevention is perhaps a bit less strong than the evidence for back sleeping. The idea is that if the baby is in the same room, the parents are more likely to hear them if something is wrong. However, the vast majority of SI deaths actually occur in the first 4 months of life.
So after that initial period, the benefits of room sharing might start to diminish.
Potentially. And there's actually some interesting emerging research suggesting that babies who transition to sleeping in their own room after those first few months might actually sleep better in the long run. One study found that infants who were sleeping alone in their own room by 9 months tended to sleep for longer stretches at night. And that pattern continued even when they were 2.5 years old.
Fascinating. What about the stuff in the crib itself? Like wearable blankets are okay, right?
Yes, wearable blankets or sleep sacks are considered a safe alternative to loose blankets, which can be a suffocation hazard. Crib bumpers, though, those are a bit more controversial.
Because they can also be a suffocation hazard.
Right. While the actual number of deaths attributed to crib bumpers is very small, there's still a theoretical risk. And they don't really provide any significant benefit in terms of preventing babies from getting their limbs stuck between the crib slats. So many experts now recommend just skipping them altogether.
Okay, let's talk about sleep schedules. When do babies typically start sleeping through the night?
Well, Cribsheet points out this interesting fact. While the average total amount of sleep a baby needs decreases from the newborn period to their first birthday, and their nap patterns will definitely change over time, the average wake-up times across babies of a similar age actually tend to vary less than their bedtimes.
So you can't really control when they wake up, but you can potentially influence when they go to bed.
Exactly. So you're trying to get your baby to sleep more overall. Focusing on an earlier bedtime might be a better strategy than trying to make them sleep later in the morning.
Okay, let's move on to a topic where the science is thankfully very clear. Vaccines.
Yes. Vaccinations are one of the most important things you can do to protect your child's health. And the evidence supporting their safety and effectiveness is overwhelming.
But there's still a lot of misinformation and fear out there, isn't there?
Unfortunately, there is. A lot of that stems from that thoroughly debunked study linking the MMR vaccine to autism. That study has been retracted, and countless studies since then have shown that there is absolutely no link between vaccines and autism.
And it's not just the MMR vaccine, right? There have been concerns about other vaccines over the years, too, like that whole thing about the pertussis vaccine causing brain damage.
Right. And while those concerns were later proven to be unfounded, those early seeds of doubt, unfortunately, contributed to the anti-vaccine movement that we're still dealing with today.
And it's so frustrating because those anti-vaccine websites, they often present themselves as being evidence-based, but they're really just cherry-picking data and misrepresenting the science.
Absolutely. The real evidence is clear. Vaccines are safe and effective. They save lives. And that whole idea about delaying vaccinations to make it gentler on the baby, there's no evidence to support that. In fact, delaying vaccinations can actually increase the risk of certain side effects.
So the recommended schedule is the best way to go. And what about those side effects? What are the actual data-supported risks of vaccines?
The most common side effects are usually mild and temporary, like soreness at the injection site, a low-grade fever, or some fussiness. These are actually signs that the vaccine is working. The body is mounting an immune response.
And how effective are vaccines, really?
They're remarkably effective at preventing serious diseases. They're not 100% foolproof, but they significantly reduce the risk of infection. And even if a vaccinated person does get sick, their symptoms are usually much milder. And then there's herd immunity, which is this amazing phenomenon where if enough people in a population are vaccinated, it helps to protect those who can't be vaccinated for medical reasons.
So it's not just about protecting your own child, it's about protecting the community as a whole. Okay, let's switch gears and talk about parental work decisions, whether to stay at home with the baby or return to work. That's a big one for a lot of families.
It is. And it's a decision that should be based on what's best for the individual family. taking into account their financial situation, their career goals, and their personal preferences. There shouldn't be this pressure to choose one way or another based on some perceived notion of what's best for the baby.
Because what does the research actually say about the impact of parental work on child development?
It's actually a pretty complex question because there's so many other factors that can influence a child's development. But when you look at studies that try to isolate the effects of parental work, the findings are generally pretty reassuring. The overall weight of the evidence suggests that whether a parent stays home or works in those first few years doesn't have a huge impact on child outcomes.
But of course, access to affordable, high-quality childcare is a huge factor, isn't it?
Absolutely. And unfortunately, the United States is pretty far behind other developed countries when it comes to paid parental leave and affordable childcare.
And the financial implications of childcare can be a major factor in those work decisions.
They definitely can. Childcare costs can be a huge expense, and Cribsheet even has some helpful examples of how to calculate the break-even point. How much income a working parent needs to bring in to cover the cost of childcare.
So the takeaway here is that there's no one right answer. It's about figuring out what works best for your family and making the choices that feel right for you. And now let's talk about childcare choices specifically, daycare versus nannies.
Choosing childcare can be so stressful. It's such a big decision, and you want to make sure your baby is in a safe, nurturing environment. So when we look at the evidence, what do we see?
Because daycare sometimes gets a bad rap, but there are also potential benefits to being in a more social setting, right?
There definitely are. And the key is quality. High-quality daycare can actually have some positive effects on a child's development, particularly in terms of cognitive skills and social development. But low-quality daycare can have the opposite effect.
So what should parents be looking for in a daycare?
Cribsheet highlights some key factors, like low child-to-caregiver ratios, warm and responsive caregivers, age-appropriate activities, and a safe and stimulating environment. And of course, cleanliness is crucial too. And then there's the nanny option, which provides more individualized care in the child's own home.
But how do you evaluate the quality of a nanny? It seems a lot trickier than evaluating a daycare center.
It definitely can be. You don't have the same level of oversight as you do with a licensed daycare. But the same principles apply. You want someone who is warm, caring, and experienced. And of course, background checks and references are essential.
And the cost of a nanny can be a major consideration too.
It typically is more expensive than daycare, although nanny shares can be a way to make it more affordable. But you also have to weigh those costs against other things, like the convenience of having childcare in your own home and the flexibility of having a nanny who can work around your schedule.
Okay, let's talk about another potentially controversial topic, sleep training. It's a word that can evoke a lot of strong emotions in parents.
It definitely can. And there are so many different approaches, from those more gradual methods to the cry it out approach, which some people view as being too harsh. But what does the research actually tell us about sleep training?
Because the big question is, does it actually work? And is it harmful to the baby?
Well, there's actually quite a bit of evidence showing that sleep training is effective at helping babies learn to fall asleep and stay asleep independently. Studies have shown that it can lead to longer stretches of sleep, fewer night wakings, and even a reduction in parental stress and depression. And as for the long-term effects on the baby, a 5-year follow-up study found no negative impact on emotional development, behavior, or attachment.
So those fears that sleep training will damage your baby's emotional well-being aren't really supported by the data.
They're not. It's important to remember that sleep deprivation can be really tough on everyone, including babies, and consistent, predictable sleep routines can actually be beneficial for their development.
What about the best age to start sleep training?
There are different opinions on that, but most experts agree that it's best to wait until the baby's at least 4 months old when they're developmentally ready. And you also have to consider their individual temperament and your own parenting style.
And you and your partner had different experiences with sleep training, your 2 kids, right?
Yeah, we did. With Penelope, we tried a more gradual approach at first, but it wasn't really working. And then our pediatrician suggested just going cold turkey and letting her cry it out. It was tough for a few nights, but then she started sleeping through the night. With Finn, we were more consistent with our approach from the beginning, and he seemed to adapt more easily.
So it's all about finding what works for your family and your baby. Okay, let's talk about another area where the recommendations have shifted quite a bit in recent years. Introducing solid foods.
Yeah, the guidelines around introducing potential allergens like peanuts have definitely changed. There used to be this idea that you should delay introducing those foods, especially for babies at high risk for allergies.
But that's not the case anymore.
Nope. Research has actually shown that early introduction of peanut-containing foods can actually help to prevent peanut allergies. So the current recommendation is to introduce those foods around the same time as other solids, which is typically around 4 to 6 months of age.
And what about the traditional approach of starting with purees and gradually increasing the texture?
That's still a perfectly valid approach.
Yeah.
But we now know that babies can handle a wider variety of textures earlier than we previously thought.
And then there's baby-led weaning, where babies are encouraged to self-feed finger foods from the beginning.
Right. And while there's not a ton of research on baby-led weaning specifically, the limited evidence we do have suggests that it might be associated with some benefits, like less picky eating and longer breastfeeding duration.
So it's all about finding an approach that feels comfortable for you and your baby. And what about those picky eaters? Any advice on how to get toddlers to eat their veggies?
It's interesting the flavors babies experience through breast milk can actually influence their food preferences later on. So if you're breastfeeding, exposing your baby to a variety of flavors through your own diet can be helpful. And once they start solids, offering a wide range of foods, even if they initially reject them, is key.
And what about vitamin supplements? Do most toddlers and young children need them?
Generally speaking, if they're eating a balanced and varied diet, they shouldn't need a multivitamin. But there are a couple of exceptions: vitamin D and iron. Breastfed babies often need a vitamin D supplement, and some babies might need extra iron, especially if they were born prematurely or had a low birth weight.
Let's touch briefly on those developmental milestones that can cause so much anxiety for parents, things like walking and...
Hey everyone, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your support means the world to me and helps the channel grow. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.